Chapter 11. It was Thursday. The sun shone enthusiastically down through Neville's window and twinkled upon the white cowboy suit which hung in its plastic covering upon the bedroom door. Neville raised a sleepy eyelid and yawned deeply. Today was going to be one to remember. He cast an eye towards the suit, pristine as a bridal gown. Beside it upon the chair hung the silver pistols in their studded holsters and the fringed white Stetson. He put a hand beneath the pillow and withdrew the chromium sheriff's star. Squinting at it through his good eye, he noted well how it caught the light, and how the mirrored surfaces shone like rare jewels. Yes, he was going to look pretty dapper tonight, that was for sure. He was still, however, harbouring some doubts regarding the coming festivities. It was always impossible to gauge exactly what the locals might do. He knew some would attend, if only for a chance at the Scotch and to take advantage of the cheap drink and extended hours. But the dart players had already defected, and the seasoned drinkers were hard upon their heels, tired of being jockeyed from their time-honoured places at the bar by the continual stream of tourists and sensation-seekers currently filling the Swan. But still, thought Neville, if only a small percentage of the morbid canal viewers turned up, the evening would be far from dull. Neville climbed out of bed, placing his star reverently upon the side table. He stifled another yawn, straightened his shoulders, and stepped to the window. From Neville's eyrie high in the upper eaves of the Swan, he was afforded an excellent view of the surrounding district. With the aid of his spyglass, he could see out between the flat blocks as far as the roundabout on the river. He could make out the gasometer and the piano museum, and on further into the early haze where the cars were already moving dreamily across the flyover. It was a vista which never ceased to inspire him. Neville's spirit was essentially that of the Brentonian. From this one window alone, he could see 5 of Brentford's 18 pubs. He could watch the larval inhabitants of the flat blocks stirring in their concrete cocoons, Andy Johnson's milk float rattling along the Kew Road, and the paper boy standing in the shadow of the bus shelter, smoking a stolen woodbine and reading one of Norman's fine art publications, destined for a discerning connoisseur in Sprite Street. This morning, as he drew great draughts of oxygen through his nose, an ominous and hauntingly familiar perfume filled Neville's head. He had scented it vaguely upon the winds for many weeks, and had noted with growing apprehension that each day it was a little stronger, a little nearer, a little more clearly defined. What it was and what it meant he knew not, only that it was of evil portent. Neville pinched at his nostrils, shrugging away this disturbing sensation. Probably it was only nerves. He stepped into his carpet slippers and down 2 flights of stairs to the bar. The paper boy, seeing the bar lights snap on, abandoned his study of the female form and crossed the Ealing Road to deliver Neville's newspaper. OMalley was stirring from his nest, wiping the sleep away from his eyes with a soiled pyjama sleeve. The man from the Emerald Isle rose, a reluctant phoenix, from the ashes of the night before. There was little fire evident in this rare bird, and had it not been for the urgency of the day which lay before him, he would surely have returned to the arms of whatever incendiary Morpheus rekindled his combustible plumage. He lit a pre-cornflake woodbine, and through the fits of terrible coughing paid his early morning respects to the statuette of Our Lady which stood noseless yet benign upon the mantelpiece. The Irishman's suite of rooms was far from what one would describe as sumptuous. The chances of it appearing in house and garden, except possibly as an example of the before school of design, were pretty remote. Upon this particular morning, however, the monotone decor was overwhelmed by an incongruous and highly coloured object which stood upon the Fablon tabletop in OMalley's dining room. It was a large and gaudy carton, bearing upon its decorative sides a logo of the carnival shop. Within this unlikely container, which OMalley had smuggled home in a potato sack, was nothing less than an accurate reproduction, correct to the smallest detail, even to the point of spurs and mask, of that well-known and much-loved mode of rangewear affected by the Lone Ranger. It was also identified in every way to the one Jim Pooley had hired not an hour previous to the furtive OMalley's entrance to the carnival shop. For Mr. Jeffreys, who ran the faltering business, it had been a day he would long remember. How he had come into the original possession of the 10 identical costumes was a matter he preferred to forget. But upon this particular day that he should, within a few short hours, not only hire out these 2 costumes, but the other 8 to boot, was quite beyond all expectation. Possibly the ancient series had returned to the small screen, bringing about a revival. Anyway, whatever the cause, he didn't care. The cash register had crashed away merrily, and there would soon be enough in it to pay off the bill for the 24 Superman costumes he'd similarly ordered in error. Neville picked up his newspaper from the welcome mat and gazed about the bar. He'd been up until 3 in the morning arranging the finishing touches. Little remained of the Swan's original character. The entire bar now resembled to a Model T the interior of a Western saloon. The sawdust which had for the last few days been getting into everybody's beer now completely smothered the floor. Wanted posters, buffalo horns, leather saddles and items of cowboy paraphernalia lined the walls. The shorts glasses had been piled in pyramids behind the bar, and the place was gaudy with advertisements promoting All Snake Belly, the drink that made the South rise again. This doubtful beverage was the sole cause of the Swan's bizarre transformation. It was a brainchild of the brewery owner's eldest son, who had spent 2 weeks on a package tour of the States and had returned with a mid-Atlantic accent and a penchant for Randolph Scott impersonations. It was not the finest blend of spirits ever to grace a bar uptick, and would probably have been more at home removing tar from barges' gumboots. The old brewer, however, was not only a man indulgent of his progeny's mercurial whims, but a shrewd and devious entrepreneur who knew a tax dodge when he saw one. Lunchtime trade at the Flying Swan was alarmingly slack. 2 sullen professional drinkers sat doggedly at the bar, glowering into their pints and picking sawdust from their teeth. Old Pete entered the bar around 12, took one look at the decorations and made a remark much favoured by gentlemen of his advanced years. Young Chips lifted his furry leg at the sawdust floor and the two departed grumbling to themselves. When Neville cashed up at 3, the till had taken less than £2. Neville counted the small change with nervous fingers. He was certain that the ominous smell he detected that morning was beginning to penetrate the beer-soaked atmosphere of the saloon bar. It all began in earnest when at 3:15 a van from the brewery catering division drew up outside the Swan in the charge of a young man with advanced acne and a cowboy hat. This diminutive figure strutted to and fro in a pair of boots which sported what the Americans amusingly call elevator heels. He announced himself to be young Master Robert and said that he would be taking over personal control of the event. Neville was horror-struck. He'd been looking forward to it for weeks. He'd got the sheriff's star and everything, and now at the 11th hour this upstart... To add insult to injury, the young man stepped straight behind the bar and drew himself a large scotch. Neville watched open-jawed as a parade of supplies sufficient to cater for half the British Army passed before his eyes in a steady and constant stream. There were packets of sausages, beef burgers, bacon burgers, beans and bacon burgers, sausage, beef and bacon burgers, and something round and dubious called a steakette. There were enormous catering cans of beans, which the porters rolled in like beer casks. There were sacks of French rolls, jars of pickled onions, radishes, beetroots, cocktail cucumbers and gherkins. There were 100-weight sacks of charcoal. "I've been light on the cooking oil," young Master Robert announced as a slack-jawed Neville watched 2 porters manoeuvring an enormous drumming through the saloon bar door. Young Master Robert drew himself another scotch and explained the situation. "Now hear this," he said, his voice a facetious parody of Aldo Ray in some incomprehensible submarine movie. "What we have here is an ongoing situation." "And what?" "We have product, that is to say, old snake belly." He held up a bottle of the devil brew. "We have location," he indicated the surroundings, "and we have motivation." Here he pointed to the banner which hung above the bar. Draped over the moth-eaten bison's head, it read, "Grand Cowboy Extravaganza. Prizes, prizes, prizes." Neville nodded gravely. "I have given this a lot of thought, brain-wise," the youth continued. "I ran a few ideas up the flagpole, and they got saluted, and I mean saluted." Neville flexed his nostrils. He didn't like the smell of this. The young man was clearly a monomaniac of the first order. A porter in a soiled leather apron, hand-rolled cigarette dripping from his lower lip, appeared in the doorway. "Where do you want this mouthful, Sincuff?" he asked, gesturing over his right shoulder. "Ah, yes, a product," said the young Master Robert, thrusting his way past Neville and following the porter onto the street. There were 108 crates of old snake belly, and when stacked they covered exactly half the available space of the newly built patio. "There is nowhere else we can put it," Neville explained. "There's no space in the cellar, and at least if here, whoever is cooking the barbecue can keep an eye on them." Young Master Robert was inspecting the barbecue. "Who constructed this?" he queried. "Two local builders." The youth strutted about the red brick construction. "There is something not altogether A-OK here design-wise." Neville shrugged his shoulders. He knew nothing about barbecues anyway, and had never even troubled to look at the plans the brewery had sent. "It is identical to the plan and has the council's seal of approval, safety-wise," Neville lied. Young Master Robert, who also knew nothing of barbecues but was a master of gamesmanship, nodded thoughtfully and said, "We will see." "What time will the extra bar staff be getting here?" Neville asked. 18:30, said the young master. "A couple of right bits to crumpet." He had obviously not yet totally mastered the subtler points of American terminology. By 6:30, the young master had still failed to light the barbecue. The occasional fits of coughing and cries of anguish coming from the patio told the part-time barman that at least the young man was by no means a quitter. At 6:45, by the Guinness clock, there was still no sign of the extra bar staff. Neville sauntered across the bar and down the short passage to the patio door. Gingerly he edged it open. Nothing was visible of young Master Robert. A thick black pall of smoke utterly engulfed the yard, obscuring all vision. Neville held his nose and squinted into the murk, thinking to detect some movement amid the impenetrable fog. "Everything going all right?" he called gaily. "Yes, fine, came a strangled voice. "Think I've got the measure of it technique-wise." "Good," said Neville. Quietly closing the door, he collapsed into a convulsion of laughter. Wiping the tears from his eyes, he returned to the saloon bar, where he found himself confronted by two young ladies of the page 3 variety, who stood looking disdainful and ill at ease. They were clad in only the scantiest of costumes and looked like escapees from some gay 90s Chicago brothel. "You the governor?" said one of the lovelies, giving Neville the old fish-eye. "Only been hanging about here, ain't we?" Neville pulled back his shoulders and thrust out his pigeon chest. "Good evening," he said in his finest Ronald Coleman. "You are, I trust, the two young ladies sent by the brewery to assist in the proceedings?" "You what?" said one. "To help behind the bar." "Oh, yeah." "And may I ask your names?" "I'm Sandra," said Sandra. "I'm Mandy," said her companion. "Neville," said Neville, extending his hand. Sandra tittered. Mandy said, "It's a bit of a dump here, isn't it?" Neville returned his unshaken hand to his pocket. "You didn't come through the streets in those costumes, did you?" "No," said Mandy. "We came in the car, didn't we?" "And you are, I trust, acquainted with the running of a bar?" Sandra yawned and began to polish her nails. Mandy said, "We've worked in all the top clubs. We're hostesses, ain't we?" Neville was fascinated to note that the two beauties seemed unable to form a single sentence which did not terminate in a question mark. "Well then, I'll leave you in charge while I go up and get changed," he said. "We can manage, can't we?" said Mandy. The cowboy suit hung behind the bedroom door in its plastic covering. With great care, Neville lifted it down and laid it upon the bed. Carefully parting the plastic, he pressed his nose to the fabric of the suit, savouring the bittersweet smell of the dry cleaner's craft. Gently he put his thumbs to the pearl buttons and removed the jacket from the hanger. He sighed deeply, and with the reverence a priest accords to his ornamentum, he slipped into the jacket. The material was crisp and pure. The sleeves crackled slightly as he eased his arms into them, and the starched cuffs clamped about his wrists like loving manacles. Without further hesitation, the part-time barman climbed into the trousers, clipped on the gun belt, and tilted the hat onto his head at a rakish angle. Pinning the glittering badge of office carefully to his breast, he stepped to the pitted glass of the wardrobe mirror to view the total effect. It was, to say the least, stunning. The dazzling white of the suit made the naturally anemic Neville appear almost suntanned. The Stetson, covering his bald patch and accentuating his dark sideburns, made his face seem ruggedly handsome. The bulge of the gun belt gave an added contour to his narrow hips, and the cut of the trousers brought certain parts of his anatomy into an unexpected and quite astonishing prominence. "Mighty fine," said Neville, easing his thumbs beneath the belt buckle and adopting a stance not unknown to the late and legendary Duke himself. But there was something missing, some final touch. He looked down and caught sight of his carpet slippers. Of course, the cowboy boots. A sudden sick feeling began to take hold of his stomach. He did not remember having seen any boots when the suit arrived. In fact, there were none. Neville let out a disparaging groan and slumped onto his bed a broken man. The image in the mirror crumpled away, and with it Neville's dreams. A cowboy and carpet suppers. A tear entered Neville's good eye and crept down his cheek. It was 7:30. The bar was still deserted. The two hostesses were huddled at a corner of the counter, sipping shandy and discussing the sex lives of their contemporaries in hushed and confidential tones. The gaudily dressed bar had become a gloomy and haunted place. Once in a while a passer-by would cast a brief shadow upon the etched glass of the saloon bar door. Conversation would cease, and the two beauties would look up in wary expectation. Neville descended the stairs upon tiptoe. The page 3 girls saw Neville's slippers before they saw Neville. They should have laughed, nudged one another, pointed and giggled, and possibly on any other occasion they would have done just that. But as the part-time barman reached the foot of the stairs, he had about him such an air of desperate tragedy that the two girls were moved beyond words. Neville squinted around the empty bar. "Hasn't anybody been in?" he asked. Mandy shook her powdered head. Sandra said, "Nah, you look dead good," said Mandy. "Suits you. Like that bloke in them films you look like," said Sandra. Neville smiled weakly. "Thanks," he said. Just then the sound of a muffled explosion issued from the direction of the patio. The yard door burst open, and down the short corridor staggered the blackened figure of young Master Robert. He was accompanied by a gust of evil-smelling black smoke, which made his entrance not unlike that of the demon prince in popular panto. As he lurched toward the bar counter, Neville stepped nimbly aside to avoid soiling his suit. The two pastry beauties stood dumb with astonishment. Young Master Robert stumbled behind the bar. Tearing the whiskey bottle from its optic, he snatched up a half-pint mug and filled it to the brim. "2 bloody hours!" he screeched in a tortured voice. "2 bloody hours! Puffing and blowing and fanning the bloody thing. And then I see it. Then I bloody see it." "You do?" said Neville. "The vents, man! Where are the bloody vents?" Neville shrugged. He had no idea. "I'll tell you where the bloody vents are. I'll bloody tell you." The line of Neville's mouth was beginning to curl itself into an awful lopsided smirk. With great difficulty he controlled it. "On the top. That's where the bloody vents are," Neville said. "Surely that can't be right." "Can't be right? I say it can't be bloody right. Some bastard had built the barbecue upside down." Neville clamped his hand over his mouth. Young Master Robert raised the half-pint pot in a charred fist and poured the whiskey down his throat. "And what shall we do then?" asked Neville, fighting a losing battle against hilarity. "And call it off, eh?" "Call it off? Not on your bloody life. No, I've fixed it proper, I bloody have. Gave it what it bloody needed. Proper Molotov cocktail. Got vents now it has, I tell you." "Oh, good," said Neville. "No damage done then?" Young Master Robert turned on the part-time barman a bitter glance. "I warned you," he stammered. "I bloody warned you." It was then he realised the bar was empty. "Here," he said. "Where is everybody?" Neville moved uneasily in his chaps. The young master fixed him with a manic stare. Mandy watched his fingers tightening about the handle of the half-pint pot. She stepped between the two men. "Come on, Bobby," she said. "Let's have a look at them burns. Can't have you getting an infection now, can we?" With a comforting but firm hand, she led the blackened barbecuist away to the ladies. Neville could contain himself no longer. He clutched at his stomach, rolled his eyes, and fell into fits of laughter. Sandra was giggling behind her hand, but she leant over to the part-time barman and whispered hoarsely, "You want to watch that little bastard? He can put the poison in for you." "Thank you," said Neville, and the two of them collapsed into further convulsions. Suddenly there was a sound at the bar door. The smiles froze on their lips, for it was at this exact moment that the Lone Ranger chose to make his appearance. He was quite a short ranger, as it happened, and somewhat stout. Neville immediately recognised the man in the mask to be none other than Wally Woods, Brentford's pre-eminent purveyor of wet fish. Wally stood a moment, magnificently framed in the doorway, considering the empty bar with a cold cod eye of suspicion. For one terrible second, Neville thought he was about to change his mind and make off into the sunset in the manner much practised in the Old West. "What'll it be, stranger?" he said hurriedly. Wally squared his rounded shoulders and swaggered to the bar, accompanied by the distinctive smell of halibut oil, which never left his person come rain, hail, or high water. "Give me 2 fingers of old snake belly," he said manfully. During the half hour that followed, the Flying Swan began slowly to fill. In dribs and drabs they came, some looking sheepish and muffled in heavy overcoats, despite the mildness of the season, others strutting through the doorway as if they'd been cowboys all their lives. 3 mavericks had begun an illegal-looking game of poker at a corner table, and no less than 6 gunfights had already broken out. Neville loaded another case of old snake belly onto the counter. Young Master Robert returned from the ladies, a satisfied expression on his face, which was a battleground of sticking plaster. Mandy was wearing her bustle on back to front. 2 more rangers arrived, swelling their ranks to 8. "What's this, a bloody convention?" asked one. Old Pete arrived wearing a Superman costume. "They were right out of Lone Rangers," he explained. A few stalwart professionals were sticking to their regular beverages, but most were taking advantage of the cut-price liquor and tossing back large measures of old snakebelly, which was proving to have the effect generally expected of white man's firewater. The last of the Lone Rangers rounded the corners at either end of the Ealing Road and strode towards the Flying Swan. One was of Irish descent, the other a well-known local personality who had but several hours before come within 1 horse of winning £250,000. The 2 caught sight of one another when they were but 20 yards apiece from the saloon bar door. Both stopped. The lone Pooley blinked in surprise. The lone OMalley's face took on a look of perplexity. Surely, he thought, this is some trick of the light, some temperature inversion or mirror image. Possibly. By the merest of chances he had stepped through a warp in the time-space continuum and was confronting his own doppelganger. A similar thought had entered the lone Pooley's mind. They strode forward, each in perfect synchronization with his twin. The lone Pooley made a motion towards his gun belt. His double did likewise. But for these 2 lone figures, the street was deserted. The sun was setting behind the gasometers, and the long and similar shadows of the 2 masked gunmen stretched out across the pavement and up the side walls of the tiny terraced houses. It was a sight to make Zane Grey reach for his ballpoint, or Sergio Leone send out for another 50-foot to standard 8. Closer and closer stalked the Rangers, their jaws set into attitudes of determination, and their thumbs wedged into the silver buckles of their respective gun belts. They stopped once more. The street was silent but for the sounds of western jollity issuing from the saloon bar. A flock of pigeons rippled up from their perch atop one of the flat blocks and came to rest upon the roof of the church hall. A solitary dog loped across the street and vanished into an alleyway. The Rangers stared at one another unblinking. "This town ain't big enough for the both of us," said the lone OMalley. "Slap leather, hombre," said the lone Pooley, reaching for his 6 guns. It would be a long reach, for they were back in his rooms upon the kitchen table where he had been polishing them. "Oh, bugger it," said the lone Pooley. Guffawing, the Ranger twins entered the Flying Swan. "Go look," said Mandy. "There's 2 more of them." "My God," cried Pooley. 10 Lone Rangers, not a tonto between a lot of us." "2 shots of a good old snake belly, please, miss," said OMalley, ogling the extra bar staff. Mandy did the honours, and on accepting OMalley's exact coinage, pocketed it away in some impossible pace in her scanty costume. "A woman after my own heart," smiled the man from the Emerald Isle. Things were beginning to hot up at the Flying Swan. Old Pete was at the piano, rattling out "I Wish I Was in Dixie" upon the moribund instrument. Young Chips was howling off-key as usual. A fight had broken out amongst the Mavericks, and Neville was flourishing his knobkerry, yet seemingly strangely reluctant to make a move from behind the bar. Young Master Robert raised his hands to make an announcement. Being ill-acquainted with the manners and customs of Brentford, he was ignored to a man. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bawled, the visible areas of his face turning purple, "if I might have your attention." Neville brought the knobkerry down on the polished bar counter with a resounding crash, and there was a brief silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," roared the young master, his high voice echoing grotesquely about the silent bar. "Ladies and gentlemen, but it was no good. The temporary silence was over as swiftly as it had begun, and the rumblings of half-drunken converse, the jingling chords of the complaining piano, and the general rowdiness resumed with a vengeance. "Time, gentlemen, please!" cried Neville, which silenced them once and for all. Young Master Robert made his announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, as a representative of the brewery," at this point young Chips made a rude noise which was received with general applause, "as a representative of the brewery, may I say how impressed I am by this turnout enthusiasm-wise?" "Enthusiasm-wise?" queried O'Malley. "As you may know, this evening has been arranged at the brewery's expense to launch a new concept in drinking pleasure." He held up a bottle of old snakebelly, "which I am glad to see you're all enjoying. There will shortly be held a barbecue where delicacies of a western nature will be served, also at the brewery's expense. There will be a free raffle, prizes for the best-dressed cowboy," and as he spoke, young Master Robert became slowly aware that the assembled company of cowboys was no longer listening. Heads were beginning to turn, whispers were breaking out, elbows were nudging. The spirit of the Old West had entered the bar. Norman stood in the Swan's portal, his suit glittering about him. The sequins and rhinestones gleamed and twinkled. He had added 4 more sets of fairy lights to the arms and legs of the costume, and these flashed on and off in a pulsating rhythm. Norman came forward, his hands raised as in papal benediction. Spellbound like the Red Sea to the wave of Moses' staff, the crowd parted before him. Turning slowly for maximum effect, Norman flicked a switch upon his belt buckle and sent the lights dancing in a frenzied whirl. To and fro about the golden motto the lights danced, weaving pattern upon pattern, altering the contours of the suit and highlighting hitherto unnoticed embellishments. Here they brought into prominence the woven headdress of an Indian chieftain, here the rhinestoned wheel of a covered wagon, here a sequined cowboy crouched in the posture of one ready to shoot it out. To say that it was wondrous would be to say that the universe is quite a big place. As the coloured lights danced and Norman turned upon his insulated brass conductor heels, the assembled company began to applaud. In ones and twos they clapped their hands together. Then as the sound grew, gaining rhythm and pace, old Pete struck up a thunderous "Oh, them golden slippers" upon the piano. The cowboys cheered and flung their hats into the air. Lone rangers of every colour linked arms like a chorus line, and high-horse silvered until they were all uniformly blue in the face. Pooley and OMalley threw themselves into an improvised and high-stepping barn dance, and the spirit of the Old West capered about in the midst of it all like an animated lighthouse. Then a most extraordinary thing happened. The sawdust began to rise from the floor towards Norman's suit. First it thickened about his feet, smothering his polished boots, and then crept upwards like some evil parasitic fungus, gathering about his legs and then swathing his entire body. "It's a static electricity," gasped OMalley, ceasing his dance in mid-kick. "He's charged himself up like a capacitor." Norman was so overcome by his reception that it was not until he found himself unable to move, coughing and spluttering and wiping sawdust from his ears and eyes, that an inkling dawned upon him that something was amiss. The crowd, who were convinced that this was nothing more than another phase in a unique and original performance, roared with laughter and fired their 6 guns into the air. OMalley stepped forward. Norman's eyes were starting from their sockets, and he was clutching at his throat. The sawdust was settling thickly about him, transforming him into a kind of wood-chipped snowman. OMalley reached out a hand to brush the sawdust from the struggling man's face, and was rewarded by a charge of electrical energy which lifted him from his rented cowboy boots and flung him backwards over the bar counter. Jim Pooley snatched up a soda siphon, and without thought for the consequences, discharged it fully into the face of the spirit of the Old West. What followed was later likened by old Pete to a firework display he had once witnessed at Crystal Palace when he was a lad. Sparks flew from Norman's hands and feet. Bulbs popped from their holders and crisscrossed the bar like tracer bullets. The crowd took shelter where they could. Young Chips thrust his head into a spittoon. His elderly master lay crouched beneath the piano, saying the rosary. The page 3 girls hurriedly ducked away behind the bar counter to where OMalley lay unconscious, his face set into an idiot grin. Norman jerked about the room, smoke rising from his shoulders, his arms flailing in the air like the sails of a demented windmill. The final bulb upon his once proud suit gave out with an almighty crack, and Norman sank to the floor, where he lay a smouldering ruin. After a moment or two of painful silence, the cowboys rose sheepishly from their makeshift hideouts, patting the dirt from their rented suits and squinting through the crowd of sawdust which filled the room. Pooley came forward upon hesitant rubber-kneed legs and doused down the fallen hero with the remaining contents of the soda siphon. "Are you all right, Norman?" he asked. "Oh, bollocks," moaned the spirit of the Old West, spitting out a mouthful of sawdust. "Oh, bollocks."